Paul, find the path through the razor wire.
Technically speaking, he's not really a murderer. He never killed anyone.
Dr. Gordon, your aim in this game is to kill Adam. If you do not, then Diana will die.
He finds ways for his victims to kill themselves.
I'm sick of people who don't appreciate their blessings. I've given your life purpose.
Looks like our friend Jigsaw likes to book himself front row seats to his own sick games.
He doesn't want us to cut through our chains. He wants us to cut through our feet.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. Not anymore.
You are a drug addict. Do you think that is why he picked you?
He helped me.
Don't believe Adam's lies.
Live or die. Make your choice.
Ciao, people, and welcome to our 150th episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earned their gold statue, or standard, if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nick, and as always, joining me at the Gold Standard Theatre is one of my two podcasting partners in crime, the Ghostwood Girl, Zan Sprouse. Hey, Zan, how's life treating you today?
Life is good. It is a deceptively nice day outside. It's lovely and breezy and sunny and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so hopefully we'll get spring eventually.
Well, here's hoping for sure. Unfortunately, we are down a professional nerd. As I'd mentioned on our previous episode, Rachel, friend, is out of commission at the moment, underwent surgery, but don't worry, folks, she's fine and well. Everything went great, and so we're definitely looking forward to her returning next time to discuss a very important movie, which we will get to later. So while we wait for the 98th Best Picture to reveal itself, today we are reviewing a movie that I selected, and that is, of course, Saw, directed by James Wan. The screenplay was by Lee Whannell, and these two gentlemen co-wrote the story together, while the score was by Charlie Clouser. On an estimate to put in today's money adjusted for inflation, this movie cost $2 million to make and made $179 million at the box office. It premiered at Sundance on January the 19th of 2004 and was then released to the general public on my birthday, October the 29th of 2004, and has a runtime of roughly 1 hour and 43 minutes. So, Zan, beginning here with general impressions, you mentioned to me this was the first time you sat down to watch this. So, what did you make of the movie that then spawned the franchise?
This was a first watch for me, and I very much did not enjoy it. I'm well aware I'm not the audience for this one. I remember when this movie came out and all the trailers made it look like something I would not enjoy because I'm not a fan of torture horror or torture porn, as I call it. You know, back in the early 2000s, movies like Hostel, Human Centipede, Serbian film Martyrs, and like Last House on the Left and Texas Chainsaw Massacre got remade. So torture kind of dominated horror in the early 2000s and like mid-teens. And I'm not anti-gore, I'm just anti-lingering on gore and the fetishistic nature of most torture movies. I love a good creative kill, but I like them to be fast moments, not like lingering solos or something. I want like, if you're gonna kill somebody in the face with a pipe, like do it fast and then move on with your story kind of thing. And because of how the trailers made this look, I was dragging my feet on watching this. I know at this point, 20 some years later, this is definitely a landmark movie of horror, but I knew it was not really my thing. And as much as I like the Insidious movies and his version of Salem's Lot that he did for HBO, James Wan is not like a must-see director for me. And because of that, this movie just really was not particularly enjoyable and kind of left me cold and questioning. But I will say that I was glad watching that this was less torture and more gross. You know, we watch people get tortured, but we don't see a lot of the torture. Even that foot sawing scene focused mostly on Adam's reaction and not the actual sawing into the bone. We actually see more of the foot on the poster than we do in the movie. And this bathroom was like train spotting levels of disgusting. It tortures the viewer and the character, and that's good because we can imagine being confused and wet and chained up and electrocuted in this disgusting room, and it makes us uneasy. And it helps us understand their desperation and their distrust of each other. I also really liked that unlike a lot of torture horror, this movie focused on torturing men instead of women. And because of that, this torture did not seem fetishistic or designed to be titillating. Even with Amanda, we see about 5 minutes of her experience. I mean, I know we learn more about her later. And we learn that she's chosen for her experience because of her substance abuse, not because she's a woman or needing to be punished for her sexuality. At this point in the franchise, her gender is not central to her character at all. And while we see Allison and Diana tied up, that's more to torture Lawrence than it is to torture them. And that was a nice change. And another thing that left me a little wanting with this one is I felt like the writing was a little bit all over the place and the dialogue wasn't great. The story is a little bit frenetic, going from Lawrence's antics to Allison's revelation of the bad marriage to Detective Tapp's obsession to Amanda's desperation to Adam's hubristic desperation to Zepp's implied compassion to Diana's honest fear, but doesn't really flesh out any stories. And I found myself trying to keep up and put the connective tissues together, but only about half of it connected in any kind of satisfying way. And a lot of things don't get explained. And you know me, backstory and folklore are my favorite parts of horror movies. I love when they unfold with backstory and you get to put the past together with the current and figure out why what's happening is happening. But with this one, it's like, what happened to Dina Meyer and his mistress? They just kind of disappear. And I know now that the answer is they're in the sequel. Well, not the mistress, but Dina Meyer's characters in the sequel. That is not satisfying when you're watching this movie. And because of the fact that we get more characters like Carrie and Amanda later, and we do learn more about Adam's fate and about Lawrence's fate later, it sort of maybe looks like you could sort of see it like this movie was teasing sequels, but it actually seems more plausible that this movie made money and the studios wanted more and the filmmaker said, oh, okay, well, who did we just leave hanging? What can we revisit? And if you're going to watch all 10, sure, but when you're watching this movie as a single story, that's very, very unsatisfying. I also thought that the bad dialogue resulted in subpar performances from otherwise really good actors. Danny Glover's fantastic, and I'm not the Carrie Elways fan that most Gen X nerd girls are, but he's good. And I felt like Glover's character's crazy was thrust upon us without a lot of explanation. And although Carrie Elways did his best to do breakdowns have tears, Carrie Elways. We just don't see the best of either actor with this, and I think a lot of that is the dialogue. Maybe we were supposed to think that his breakdown was fake, keeping us questioning Lawrence this whole time, but it really just sort of, the more I thought about it, the more it felt like it's somebody doing the best with what they had. And I think the person that did the best with what they had in this was Tobin Bell. And what that tells me is that Jigsaw is where the writers were paying attention in this movie. I think everything else was sort of secondary to get to Jigsaw. Now, all that being said, I totally get why people love this movie. I totally understand why it has become what it has become. It is gory, it is unpleasant, it is tense. And like I said, to its credit, it's not overly sexual. And with everything I've said about the things that bothered me about it, the ending was very well done and very creative. Jigsaw is a great concept. I'll talk more about him when we talk about Jigsaw and the ending. But as a concept, there's a lot of really good things here with Jigsaw. I just didn't particularly like the execution of it.
And that is totally fair. I think it's going to make for a great conversation today, indeed. And when I think about this movie, what stays with me isn't just the violence, it's the feeling that you were alluding to, that tight, airless pressure that builds from the first few minutes and never really lets go. Because, yeah, the film traps you in one grim, dirty room and it dares you to sit there. And it's claustrophobic on purpose. It wants you to feel uncomfortable. And on the surface, it looks like a simple horror setup. People wake up in a nightmare and have to survive it. But underneath that, it's really about control and morality. I mean, it asks ugly questions like, what is a life worth? Do people value it only when it's about to be taken away? And who gets to decide who deserves a second chance? And what makes it interesting is that the horror isn't random. It's very structured. It's very deliberate because the traps aren't just meant to kill. They're designed as tests. And that's, I think, what gives the film its edge. It's not chaos, it's judgment. And that judgment is warped and obsessive and almost clinical. You can feel the cold logic behind it. Visually, yes, it's very raw. The lighting is sickly, the camera moves like it's nervous, and the editing can feel frantic, especially in the trap sequences. I mean, some people do find that style dated now, but I think at the time it gave the movie a harsh, almost DIY intensity. I mean, it felt desperate and aggressive, and the low budget to an extent actually helps, because the roughness makes it believable. It feels like something that could happen in a forgotten basement somewhere. And then there's the twist that you were mentioning. That's what really changed the game, I think, because it reframes everything you thought you understood. Suddenly the room feels even smaller. The idea that you were watching the truth the whole time but didn't see it is very unsettling. And I don't think it's just shock for shock's sake. It's a structural payoff. And I also think that the film works because it doesn't try to be polished or comforting. It's mean, let's be honest. It doesn't soften its message. It forces you to sit with desperation. And to your point, it's less about gore and more about watching people confront impossible choices. And that psychological tension is what lingers. So at its core, I think this film feels like a twisted moral fable, almost dressed up as a horror film. It's grimy and it's intense and sometimes excessive, but I think it knows exactly what it's doing because it set the tone for a whole wave of horror that followed. And yeah, even if you don't love it, I think you can't ignore its impact, like you were mentioning, Zan. I think it took a simple idea, locked it in a room and squeezed it until something unforgettable came out. So yes, I am one of those who very much enjoys this franchise, both with the good and the bad. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with our two guys trapped in the room. We have, of course, one of our writers and storytellers, Lee Whannell as Adam, and Carrie Elwes as Dr. Lawrence Gordon. So what did you make of these two, Zan?
Like I was saying before, one of my favorite things about horror is when the story unfolds as it tells you backstory. And the backstory is kind of where the horror lies, either in what happened to our antagonist, what made our antagonist the way it is, the history of this house, or that kind of thing. And this movie started to feel like it was maybe going to go there with Lawrence because we spend so much time on him and what makes him kind of good for being our villain in this, his apparent coldness towards his patient John, who has stage 4 cancer, his dismissiveness of Zepp the orderly, who seems to be the one with the compassion. He's a terrible husband. And he's a better father than I expected him to be when we first saw him interacting with Diana, where she has the nightmare and he's like, just a second, let me finish this sentence. But then he is very attentive with her, but it's still pretty surface level parenting. He needed to check the damn closet. Thank you very much. And he's even a bit of a jerk to Carla, his mistress. Like, did he leave her to pay for that shitty hotel room? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. I think he might have actually done that, even though he does in fact leave without doing anything. I don't necessarily think this was the first time they'd done this. So, anyway, but like I said, ultimately this attempt at backstory doesn't really go anywhere. And even though it does do these things of making you think he is, pun intended, the puppet master, by making him kind of a shitheel, he's tries to control the situation while he's in the bathroom with Adam. His evidence at the crime scene, his pen light being there, even the fact that Tap is so obsessed with him make him seem like he's really good for this. But I've seen a lot of horror movies, and if you take these tropes and you combine it with the fact that he's a really famous actor, made it seem a little too obvious for him to be our killer for me. We do get some backstory with him, but like I said, he's kind of a shitheel. He's a bad husband. He's not the most compassionate doctor, but he doesn't feel as egregious as to have this experience be something he deserves. And even more than that, we really don't feel like Allison and Diana deserve this. Like, all of the backstory that we get of him, he's not a great guy, but is he what Jigsaw does to him not a great guy? Lots of doctors are kind of elitist and dismissive. Lots of men cheat on their wives. I don't know if it's me or if it's us as a culture that we're so desensitized to those tropes that, that's not enough for us to think like, yeah, get him, Jigsaw. But I don't, yeah, he's not a great guy. But what I think that does most for us with him as a character is it makes me really wonder if he's actually going to come back and keep his promise to Adam. When he's saying, I have to do something or I'm going to bleed to death. I'm going to crawl out of here and I promise I'll come get you. And because he's such a shitty guy, I don't know if he's actually going to. And and in this movie, we don't know. We find out later exactly what happens to both of them, but we don't know in this movie. And so I feel like that's more where his being a shitty guy pays off in this because I am watching this and watching him and I'm watching him have his moral dilemmas of like, kind of sort of being a decent father when he probably isn't there very much. And even saying things on the phone, I was always happy with you. He seems like a guy that is having an affair because he can, not necessarily because he hates his family or anything like that. He's just hubristic. And again, as you were talking about, do people really appreciate life and the things they have? He's just doing this because he has the opportunity. Like, does he appreciate his privilege? And like, is that where Jigsaw's coming with it? I don't know. But like I said, he doesn't feel egregious enough to be getting the Jigsaw treatment, but he does seem egregious enough to make me wonder, is he is he going to keep his promise to Adam? Because I also don't think that he is maybe a sidekick. Like, I don't think that it gets to a point where I'm like, I really don't think he has anything to do with this. Even though the movie keeps trying to make us think that a lot of people do, like, especially with Tap, I'll talk more about him later, that he is somehow involved. But with what we're seeing and what we're learning about this character, I don't think, I stopped pretty early thinking that he actually has something to do with this. And like I said, maybe it's because I've seen too many tropes and I know, like, okay, he's the main focus, this bad of a guy, left his pen light there, and he's carry always too obvious. Maybe that's just my cynicism from having seen a million movies. But like I said, the how it ends with Adam, I will say that I was left questioning because of his character, and I thought that was kind of cool. Adam is interesting because Adam is set up to be the beta character, but by the end, it seems like this was all orchestrated for him, And like I said, he seems as such a beta character because he finds himself sort of looking to Lawrence for guidance in this situation, even though Adam doesn't want to, and he hates that. He's looking to Lawrence because as shitty as Lawrence is, he is one of those like take charge assholes. Like, I got this, just make it happen. Like, he's one of those guys that acts like if he says it, it will happen. Um, Adam even goes along with a dumb poison cigarette plan. And he does it. I have to say, he does a great job of the bad acting that probably just pissed off Jigsaw. Like, Jigsaw is watching them, and that is another thing I liked about this when we realize that there are two people watching them, or two people watching what's going on. One of them is Tap, and one of them is Jigsaw. But Jigsaw has way better cameras. I'm pretty sure Jigsaw heard everything they were planning and knew exactly what they were figuring out. So they probably just pissed him off, which is probably why he electrocuted Adam in the first place. Um, and also Adam, like the audience, is has been sort of led to believe that Lawrence is the crux of this whole thing because of what he knows about the fact that from having done surveillance on him and taken photos of him and all of that. And the problem with that is that even when he does tell Lawrence about how he knows about him, I feel like that says more about Tap than it says about Adam. Like, Adam's just doing this for money. Adam talks about, from the very beginning, he says, what's the first thing you remember? I don't know. I was in my shithole apartment and now I was here. And then even when he says, like, you want to know what I do? I make money taking pictures of guys like you. So we sort of know that Adam isn't having the greatest time of it with life. If he's doing basically obsessed private detective gig work and living in the shithole apartment, he's not having the best time of it. But again, what did Adam do aside from being adjacent to Lawrence to get the treatment he gets in this story? Because by the end of this movie, we see that there is somebody who very much wants Adam to suffer a lot, like almost more than Lawrence suffers. I mean, now had Allison and Diana died, Lawrence would have suffered more, but by the end of this, Adam gets the rawest deal, and from the beginning, we sort of see a little bit more of his torture process. Waking up in that bathtub is terrifying. And he kind of gets the worst of what the room has. He's got to reach into the toilet. He's got the saw that breaks. He's the first one to be electrocuted. And then he gets that extra added torture and panic of realizing that he allowed his freedom to literally go down the drain when he got out of the tub and pulled the plug. The key literally went down the drain with him, and someone knew that was going to happen. Someone orchestrated that key being in the tub, probably near the drain, to ensure peak mental torture for Adam. And I never really get a satisfying reason as to why somebody wants that. It's like, Adam is a sleazy photographer that seems to have sunk below the level of paparazzi to make a buck, but is it worth all of this? Does he need to be left to die in the dark? Like, what did he do? And the way these two characters interact with each other is very interesting. How they start out as strangers who seem to be in the same situation, but who don't trust each other because in between them is a dead body. You know, let's if the movies let's remind us of the foreshadowing of what little foreshadowing the movie gives us. That there's a body between them and they each have a note, they each have a tape. So each one of them sort of knows the other one is, shady in some way. And in their situation, they are not to be trusted. And they do things like, how did you know to turn the light off? How did instinct? What do you mean instinct? Like what instinct leads you to this situation? But they wind up with the tables turned, where, like I said, you think that Lawrence is the main focus, but Adam really does sort of seem to be the main focus of the torture, which is very strange because we don't get enough backstory for Adam. All we get for Adam, again, is how he interacts with Lawrence. We see him in the parking garage. That's a parking garage, not a parking lot, by the way. Taking the photo of him. We see him in his shithole apartment, developing photos, so we know kind of who he is and what he does, but we have nothing about his life. He's probably doesn't have a kid with all of those photography chemicals lying around, but does he have a girlfriend? Did he leave a wife and kid? We don't know. And so what we're left with is how these two interact with each other. And I think they do a good job with what they have of not trusting each other and grudgingly trusting each other when they do have to work together. Throw me the recorder. I don't want to break it. Throw me your tape. Just little things like that. Or even when Adam sees the photo in his wallet, but in Lawrence's wallet, but doesn't necessarily tell him that, waiting to divulge that information when it seems normal or when it seems pertinent. I don't think that Adam doing that sets Adam up to be the bad guy the way we've been setting up Lawrence to be the bad guy this whole time. But I did appreciate their interactions with each other. They're not immediately friends. They're not immediately enemies. They grudgingly work together when they have to. They both experience similar things. They're both chained up by the leg. They both get electrocuted. Jigsaw orchestrates it to sort of make them trust each other when they're supposed to. And then, when things go awry, everything goes awry. But like I said, these two characters being cat, and it's interesting you mentioned this movie seeming larger and smaller because it is a very small room that they're in, but it seems huge when you see them so far apart from each other and trying to reach things and not being able to reach things. And even if they were able to get to each other, no matter what they did, they would have to step over a dead body. So, it's like it's a small space that looks larger than it is and feels more confining than it looks. And it's a very interesting thing that goes on with your senses mentally while you're watching these two figure out when they should trust each other.
I very much agree. And, and you bring up some fantastic, fantastic points. I do think that the dynamic between these two is really the emotional core of the story. Because Adam does feel like the everyman. He's reactive and confused and angry, and he doesn't have control over anything, and he knows it. And there's something I think very human about the way he panics and jokes at the wrong moments and tries to bargain with a situation that clearly can't be bargained with. And I think he represents fear in its most immediate form. Survival and not morality is his focus. He didn't ask to be part of any larger lesson. The guy just wants out. You can't really blame him. Lawrence is different because he does carry guilt long before the situation escalates. There's distance in him, and even before the trap forces him to confront his life, to your point, you can sense detachment. He's analytical and clinical and trying to think his way through something that was designed to break logic. And what makes him interesting is that his test feels personal. It's not just about survival, it's about whether he values what he claims to value in, of course, a very twisted and sick way. And I think the contrast of these two characters drives the tension, because one is emotional and impulsive, and the other is rational yet repressed. And as pressure builds, these roles start to blur because fear strips away the composure and the desperation exposes what's underneath. And you see how fragile both men really are when pushed to the edge. I think most of us would be anyhow. And what I found compelling is how the room, once again, forces intimacy between two strangers who don't trust each other. I mean, they're chained together physically, but also psychologically. They have to talk. They have to reveal pieces of themselves. And then, yeah, of course, suspicion grows, then cooperation, then betrayal, then understanding. It's messy and uncomfortable, which I think makes it feel real. So by the end, I think both characters leave an impression for different reasons. Adam's arc feels more tragic and grounded. Lawrence's arc feels more extreme and transformative. Together, I think they anchor the film. And without that two-person tension, the story wouldn't have nearly the same weight. But I do also agree when it comes to you bring up the fact of Carrie Elwes kind of started to learn how to cry, because there were moments where I too was not particularly, I wasn't buying it 100%, and I've seen this movie multiple times. But that's a great point that you brought up there, Zan. So let's get to the man who has made it his mission to catch the Jigsaw Killer. We have the aforementioned and wonderful Danny Glover, of course, as Detective David Tapp. So what did you make of our detective?
Yeah, I really wanted more backstory for this character, because I even went back and rewatched his parts thinking, did I miss something with him? Because I feel like we go from A to Z with him and absolutely nothing in between. We start out, he's the proverbial obsessed detective, but we don't get enough of his story as to how he got where he is now, I don't think. We see him, we have the flashback of him, blowing off after work beers so he can stay on the case. And then he figures out how they're going to find Jigsaw's lair, and then they go on that relentless chase that results in his partner getting killed and his throat getting slit. So we start out with him learning that he was at one point a very, very good detective. And so I don't quite get why somebody who was as good of a detective as they were telling us that Tapp was, how he doesn't figure out that it's not in fact Lawrence. That was odd to me, because I feel like somebody with his deduction skills could have probably figured that out. And the reason he's not figuring that out is because he goes from good detective to suspended obsessed nut job who's completely on the wrong track. And that doesn't work for me, because like I said, that's our A to Z right there. We need something in the middle to go from good detective to suspended obsessed nut job, and we're not getting it. And we see him with his whole I should have never let you go, blah blah blah, and really being obsessed. And like I said before, we do see that he's watching. He has the photos. He's obviously hired Adam. He's watching himself on a closed circuit camera system. He's nearby the apartment. But how is he so far off the deep end that he just watches Zepp do what he does to Alice and Diana and still think, someone's in your house, doctor? He's still not putting it together. It was very strange for me. You would think that seeing Zepp would show him that he's completely on the wrong track, but he keeps watching this happen. He's obviously seeing that Zepp is there. He probably saw Zepp come in the house and get in Diana's closet. He probably knows that Zepp is still there and Lawrence has left, but he's still so tunnel visioned on him. And it's I get that he regrets letting go of who he thinks is not just a sadistic killer, but also the man who murdered his partner. And I also get that we see him before, like I said, we saw him seeming like a good detective, but then we see him making really tenuous connections, the dentist who's on the same sewer line, doctor. It's what? I mean, how much of the city is on the same sewer line? Where are we going with this? Is it because they're both doctor? I don't quite understand. And there's a lot. I'm assuming that there's a lot that went on with Tapp that we didn't see that would explain this for me. And I would have loved to have had that, because like I said, this is Danny Glover. This is a good actor. We've set this guy up to go from good detective to obsessed nut job. And we know that there has been detecting, even though we don't even see him get suspended. We just learn that he is. We don't see that, you're off the deep end, Tapp. I need your badge and your gun. We don't have one of those McBain type of moments with him. But yet we know he's still detecting. Like I said, he's got his own photos all over the wall, his own his own board with the connective strings on it, just in his where he's obviously not in his apartment. He's obviously someplace where he can be near Lawrence so he can follow him. But like I said, you would think that by following Lawrence, he would know that he's not doing this. He would have seen whoever took Lawrence. Like, I don't know, in all of this surveillance that he's still doing when he's not supposed to, how he didn't figure this out. And so I feel like a character like this that you're going to get Danny Glover to play deserves more. Deserves more of a backstory, deserves more of an arc, deserves more development, and honestly deserves better than to accidentally shoot himself in the chest. That felt so incredibly anticlimactic for this sort of tragic hero character that we have here, because we do really feel for him. Also, I don't quite understand why he's the only cop at all dealing with this. Again, where's Dina Meyer? We know that his partner was murdered, but did that seriously make his captain say, "Okay, we're just done with this guy until he shows up again, we're just going to forget about it"? I feel like somebody else would be on this, and therefore somebody else would probably have seen some of the same stuff, or I don't know. I just feel like this character deserved more, and for as smart as we made him seem when we first met him, I feel like him not figuring this out for as long as he doesn't figure it out. Like, he only starts to get involved when he sees that Allison and Diana are in trouble. It's like they've been in trouble this whole time. Since this weird dude went and hid in Diana's closet. Where have you been? So I don't know. Maybe he's just too old for this shit.
I'm so glad that you brought that reference up, Zan.
One of us was gonna.
Exactly. And somebody else might later down the line when it comes to our feedback as well. So we might see that phrase show its raise its head again. But I very much agree. The way you talking about this, it does make me sort of re-question some of the choices that David makes throughout the course of this movie. And I agree with you. I did find it rather underwhelming the way that our character leaves the show literally and exits by shooting himself. I was like, you can't do Danny Glover that dirty, man. That's not really cool. But I suppose maybe maybe he wasn't going to be signing on for other films, because we obviously at the time we don't know whether Lee Whannell and James Wan knew there would be other films in the pipeline. Probably not, because maybe this was a project they did hoping it would do well.
I do get the feeling that Danny Glover was like, I'm one and done with this motherfucking movie.
It could very well be.
He doesn't seem like the type of guy that wants the horror renaissance of his career to be in slasher movies. So I can see him needing to be written out of this, but they did him dirty with that.
I definitely agree. I definitely was like, guys, I'll do your movie, but I'm only doing one. But yeah, the David character does feel like the quiet tragedy running parallel to the main nightmare, because he may not be chained to a pipe, but in a way he's just as trapped. His obsession becomes its own kind of prison, because you can see how the case eats at him, and it costs him professionally and physically and mentally. And the closer he gets to the truth, the more it pulls him apart. What I think makes him interesting is that he's driven by a sense of justice, but that drive slowly curdles into fixation, because he believes he's the one who sees the pattern and the one who understands what's happening. And maybe he does. But the more isolated he becomes, the harder it is to tell whether he's chasing the truth or chasing his own need to be right. And there is also a sadness to him. He's not flashy or heroic. He feels worn down. And his investigation doesn't feel triumphant. It feels very desperate. Every step forward seems to cost him something. And I think that makes his storyline feel grounded compared to the theatrical cruelty happening elsewhere. And in a film full of engineered moral tests, David's struggle feels human and messy, because he isn't playing a game with rules. He's trying to make sense of chaos. And in doing that, he shows how easily the pursuit of justice can turn into self-destruction, as we do see. And he does, I think, add weight to the world of the film, as without him, the story would feel more contained and maybe almost abstract. And I think through him, you see the ripple effects, that the horror doesn't stay in one room, it spreads. But yes, I very much agree with you, Zan. It would have been a nicer way to send off this character and this actor, at least when it came to this movie. So let's round off our characters with our red herring and our true killer. We have Michael Emerson as Zepp Hindle and Tobin Bell as John Kramer, aka Jigsaw. So what did you make of these two?
Well, these are my two favorite performances. Even though I have issues with their characters, I thought the actors did a fantastic job with them. The thing about Zepp is that I don't know what we're supposed to think about him when, when we learn that Zepp is the guy in the closet and he's not just a throwaway character, just there to show you that Lawrence is not a particularly compassionate guy. Are we supposed to think he's compassionate, or is he just annoyed with Lawrence's dismissiveness of his patients? The way he's like, his name is John. This character sort of put me in mind. We were talking before about, I think before we went on the air, we were talking about Rob Zombie, and this character kind of reminded me of the Danny Trejo character in Rob Zombie's reboot of Halloween, but I didn't, I thought maybe there were more parallels to that, because was he maybe nice to John as the orderly? Like, was he the orderly that made sure he had, my dad, when he was hospitalized a lot before he passed, he always made friends with the guys that brought him food because he would get extra ice cream at night. Like, was Zepp doing that for him? Is he a psychotic sadist, or is he just kind of simple and just very desperate? I couldn't really tell for a while if he was desperate and just trying to follow the rules of the game to save himself, or if he's really into this because of how focused he was on killing Lawrence now that he didn't succeed in killing Allison and Diana and following the rules and all of that. Like, I didn't quite know what he was supposed to be. And I think my confusion worked with making him a good red herring for this, because even before we see any of this about him, when we see him revealed as the man in the closet, we're like, oh, it's that fucking guy. Like that, like I said, the orderly, I think he was doing trash or laundry or something, and Lawrence is doing his rounds talking about, this here is a stage 4 cancer patient. He has a name and it's John. He's very interested in humanizing the patient, John as a patient. So that sort of makes you think, like, is he in on this? Is he part of this? Is he a sidekick in this? And it really does make you think about that, because we know that Jigsaw can't be there watching these two guys and kidnapping the wife and daughter at the same time. So we know he has to have somebody. And I think the confusion we have with Zepp is like, oh, Zepp's in on this. And then we start to wonder, is Zepp the main guy? And the guy looking at them we don't quite know. And so I think that character ambiguousness helps feed that red herring a little bit. But because of what we start to learn about, like I said, pun intended, our puppet master's MO, we are not surprised at all when we find out that he's another victim. Even though we did spend some time thinking he was an accomplice, when we find out that he's a victim and he's there, would you kill a mother and daughter to save yourself? He has been poisoned. Jigsaw's the only one with the antidote. And so we're not terribly surprised by it when it happens. It answers a question more than it gives us a shocking moment. Like, oh my God, that's not, because we definitely know there's two people. We know there's more than one guy. So it's not like he's the only person in this. And we're pretty sure that he's not the puppet master because of, I have to do this because these are the rules. Talking about the rules. You're too late and all of that. So we know he's following someone. He's not the main guy. But when we find out that he's following somebody because he's a victim rather than following somebody because he is also a sadistic, psychotic sadist, then again, I sort of go back to, like, okay, so is he just kind of simple-minded? Is he just desperate? Like, what is it? And again, no backstory, not understanding where he comes into this, why he's chosen, anything like that. I do feel sympathy for this character because there is a major desperation there, because what's going on with him as a victim is he can't see it. Has he been injected with poison? I don't actually know. Jigsaw could have just told him that he was, but it still would have had the same effect. Or he could have injected him with some sort of placebo. I don't know. Again, hindsight being 2020, where is Jigsaw getting all of this stuff when he's mostly been stage 4 cancer bedridden, but whatever. Yeah, I do feel a lot of sympathy for Zep because of that. He is one of the more sympathetic characters because we don't have any sort of real backstory on him other than he's just he seems like just an honest dude trying to make an honest living who might actually, be sort of on the less intelligent side, and we don't know. So because we don't know, I think I'm more apt to feel sympathetic about him. But again, when it comes to characters that leave me with questions, freaking Jigsaw. I've been calling him in my head, I'm calling him Jigsaw John because we do find out that the patient in bed, the stage 4 cancer patient that Lawrence is talking about when he's making his rounds, and that Zep reminds him has a name that is John, that is in fact Jigsaw. We do find that out. I think Tobin Bell does a fantastic job with what he has to work with when it comes to this character, but I think at least for this movie as a standalone movie as it was in 2004, Jigsaw fails as so many horror movies do in that he is a great concept that is poorly executed. So many horror stories, I'm talking movies, books, whatever, TV shows, start out with a great idea, but their writers don't really know what to do after this initial concept. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the ending. But for a character that puts in so much thought and creativity into these torture scenarios, he doesn't seem to have any real motives or reasons for who he chooses and why. I mean, these are not great people, but are they death by jigsaw bad people? We've been talking about this whole time, he has this whole no one is grateful for their blessings and the fact that they are alive, or no one is grateful enough for their blessings and the fact that they're alive. But these tortures seem very personal and extremely sadistic. What is it about John that created the sadistic streak? What makes him want to punish the ungrateful so badly? How does he choose who's ungrateful enough? What is making him do this instead of being grateful for the fact that he can get up from his stage 4 cancer bed and move around and kidnap people? We do find out again, a lot of my answers to my questions are it's in the sequel, but as someone who has just watched this first movie and thinking as someone who watched this for the first time in 2004, when this was still just kind of an indie movie that may or may not go anywhere, you're left with these questions. What made him want to punish the ungrateful so badly? Where did his about to lose his life turn him so sour on everyone else who still has life but isn't appreciating it? What about him made that happen? Also, what the hell did Zep ever do to him, and how is Zep an ungrateful character? He has this whole thing about, appreciate life, appreciate your blessings, and nobody's grateful enough for the fact that they're still alive. But what blessings does he have that he's not appreciating? We don't see enough of Zep to see what he's not doing. Does he think, is Zep, in fact, a sadistic homicidal genius and he's wasting his talents as an orderly at the hospital? I don't know. We don't know that. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense why he's a victim. Not to mention Diana, who is a literal child. What makes Jigsaw so sadistic and anti-Lawrence that he is willing to give a man who he is told is dying a gun and send him to kidnap a child? Yeah, she's living a privileged life because her dad makes money, but what is she, like 8? How has she even learned who she is, let alone to appreciate the life she has? This is just all she knows. She's a kid. These are her parents. She has nightmares. Her parents are fighting. We all know that kind of thing. What did she possibly do? There's a lot going on here. I have so many questions about this character. And like I said, he's so creative, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. His reveal is so wonderful. He's a great concept that I don't think we knew what to do with in just this one movie. And Nick, you said before when we were talking about Tap that Tap is a character that shows you that this horror goes outside of this room. I almost wonder if we had kept it to the room, if we could have had more about this guy or had less about this guy. I feel like if we didn't have this connection to him being the cancer patient and just left it with no one is grateful for the life they have. If we left it more ambiguous, I feel like I'd have less questions, if that makes sense. But because we opened these cans of worms, I now have these questions and I am left unsatisfied and I am left with an opinion of Jigsaw that is less than what it should be based on Jigsaw as a concept, I think.
I definitely think so because, like you said, if he does punish the unworthy, then there should be some boundaries as to who he selects, as I guess any killer would when it comes to their MO or their obsession or whatever their deal is. And here it does seem like he kind of goes after pretty much anybody. So it makes you think that even if you live your life well and you haven't done anything necessarily wrong, you could wake up the next day in a trap. And I think maybe that was the idea here before exploring more of John's ideology. Maybe was that feeling of unsettled, made the audience feel unsettled of you could maybe someday wake up and be in a trap and you don't know why. But you bring up a great point. And of course, like you said, as the movies progress, they do try to explain why John does what he does. But of course, if you just watch this film, you are left with the understandable questions that you, of course, have. These two, I think, serve very different psychological functions. And even though the film initially blurs that line, because Zepp is presented as a menace, I mean, the camera treats him like a predator. I mean, the music swells around him and he moves through the scenes with this twitchy intensity that makes you think he's the architect of everything. But when you look closer, like you said, he feels less like a mastermind and more like a pawn trying to survive. I mean, there's fear behind his actions. He doesn't carry the calm certainty of someone in control. He does feel pressured and cornered and reactive. And that shift in perception is crucial because it reframes him from villain to participant, just operating in a different part of the board. And then, of course, there's John, aka Jigsaw. What makes him unsettling, I very much agree, isn't the physical presence, it's the ideology, it's the literal idea of him. Because he doesn't see himself as a murderer, he sees himself as a teacher. And that moral self-justification is what gives the film its edge. Because he builds these elaborate scenarios and calls them opportunities. And he then distances himself from the violence by claiming he never directly kills anyone. It's a technicality, but to him it matters. And that cold reasoning is far more disturbing, I find, than simple brutality. Kind of makes me think of Charles Manson, who said he never killed anybody, but through him, people were killed. What's effective is how composed John is and feels, because there's patience there, there's planning, and there's a belief that he understands human nature better than the people he's testing. And in this first film especially, he operates almost like an idea more than a person, a presence, a philosophy about suffering and value. And you very cutely illustrated that. And I think together, these two play with perception, because one looks like the monster but isn't the true source, and the other appears fragile and insignificant at first, yet holds all the control. And I think that reversal is part of what makes the ending land so hard, because it forces you to reconsider who actually had power the entire time. And in a film obsessed with control, these two represent opposite ends of it. You have one scrambling to survive inside the rules. The other is calmly writing them. And I absolutely loved Tobin Bell's performance here and in the subsequent movies. And I'm so glad this movie literally gave him a job and multiple other films. And that voice is just so iconic to this day, even when it's not slightly distorted. Tobin has a beautiful, beautiful voice, in my opinion. So let's get to how this movie ended. Of course, as we were alluding to, the corpse lying in the room suddenly rises to its feet, and it turns out to be John Kramer, who of course is the real Jigsaw killer. John then tells Adam that the key to his chain was in the bathtub. It went down the drain when Adam had first awoken and drained the water. Adam attempts to shoot John with Zepp's gun, but John electrically shocks him through his chain. He then, he then exits the bathroom before sealing the door with the famous phrase, "Game over," leaving Adam alone to die. So what did you make of this ending, Zan?
I want to go back to what you said a minute ago. Yeah, this is mostly Tobin Bell's voice. It's like a tiny bit distorted, but it's not like Ghostface voice or anything like that, where it's definitely, I mean, this is mostly him. And so he does a really phenomenal job. And I'm happy to hear that they do flesh out this character because, like I said, this character is a fantastic concept, very well performed. Tobin Bell is like up there with people like, and I'll talk about this more in a second, people like Robert Englund for just being known for this and doing this as well as they can. But like I said, I like knowing that there's 9 more movies. One of them was 3D, for God's sake. Um, I'm not a big fan of 3D movies. It always feels gimmicky to me. I did not mind Tron Legacy because it's only the grid stuff that's 3D, but yeah, 3D is not my jam. It also makes me sick. It makes me motion sick. So it's hard for me to do. But I like knowing that this character gets more and more with each movie. But like I said, that makes this movie you want you either want so much more or so much less, like I said. Um because this character deserves it, frankly. So and that's kind of as cool as this ending is in parts, I'm left wanting so much because of, if you start it, please finish it. when it comes to characters like this. So first of all, oh my God, Lawrence, turn that box over. Okay? When he's trying to use the box to get the phone and it's open side up, I'm like, turn it over and you can use it as a scoop to get the phone. Just turn it over. Now, if that had been done earlier in the movie, like kudos to James Wan if he'd put that earlier in the movie, because that would have made me think, oh, this guy is putting on an act. He's part of it. But by this point, it was way too late for that, and I am proportionately unrealistically annoyed by this because of that. Because I'm just watching him going like, I'm only 5'6", so if like I know how to like use a water bottle at the grocery to like get stuff off of the top shelves and that kind of thing. I'm like, oh my God, just turn it over, scoop it up, scoop up the phone. It's ringing, scoop it up. So yeah, to be fair to this ending, the reveal of Jigsaw was brilliantly done. It was extremely well done. The filmmakers did a great job of not really foreshadowing this that much at all. Like we said, we were introduced to everybody in the room. This is Adam, this is Lawrence, this is the dead body. But then that's about it. Other than just having the body there in the first place, there's really a not a foreshadowing. There's no like shots of the body that linger too long. There's no like wink when it comes to this body. Okay? It's just there. There were times when I just kind of forgot it was even there. The bathroom is so gross, with excrement everywhere and the nasty rusty pipes and everything and blood on the floor from now everybody, especially because Lawrence has cut his foot off. Even the blood was just kind of there. Its presence just added to the grossness of the room and the severity of the situation. The body was basically pipes and the gross toilet and everything, everything that made that room gross. The body was just one more thing in that list. And so it worked really well when when he just sits up reveal. Because we've seen so many movies where the killer just sits up. We've seen that in Halloween. We've seen it everywhere where we think the killer's dead and they sit up and it's fine. We think this guy's dead from the beginning and we have no reason to think he's the killer because we've seen Zep and we've heard Jigsaw. And Jigsaw is somehow reacting to this in real time. Not quite sure how that's working, but nothing about this story, nothing about what the filmmakers did gave us any sort of wink to the fact that you're going to need to pay attention to this body later. And honestly, here's where this movie opening cans of worms it never closes works for itself. Because by the time this movie, if I had seen that, now this movie is 20 years old, I knew this was coming. So I was actually looking for it. I was looking to see, was there a way to know? And there's really not. Even when I knew it was coming, I'm like, oh yeah, the body's there. That's right. Jigsaw's in the room. Like I would still sometimes forget that Jigsaw was there. But if I had seen this in 2004 and I would have had the same reaction I'm having now with like questioning so many things and so many things that don't seem to go anywhere, not enough backstory, not enough explanation, moral compass, not enough character exposition, not enough character growth. The fact that there was a body there that they just kind of did nothing with would have made sense to me because there were so many things in this movie that didn't make sense to me. And so this actually works for itself because, watching this, you're like, even if I had never known what was going to happen, I would have been like, oh my God, holy shit, they actually meant to have something there for no reason. They wanted you to think that was there for no reason. They just wanted you to think that there were three people playing this game and one of them just lost before the audience even got there. So, it's like, good job, movie. But like I said, I was looking for some sort of tell for this body being part of the being a bigger part of this, other than to make the room gross and tense and to have a sense of imminent danger. And there just isn't. There isn't anything. And like you were saying, he makes the room feel smaller because, even though the room is big enough that these two guys can't reach each other, even if they could, they would have to reach over a pool of blood and a dead body. So that was fantastic because, like I said, we've seen a million times you think he's dead, but he's not. But this body was essentially an inanimate object that was there for atmosphere that turns out to be, again, pun intended, puppet master of the whole thing. I keep saying that because there is a jigsaw puppet, the one you see with the black hair and the spirals on the cheeks and everything. That's why I keep saying puppet master. Aside from that, I found this ending so unsatisfying because even though we have this creative killer reveal and we learn about everyone's role in Lawrence's life and their role in the game, I'm still made of questions. And I made a list of all of the questions that I have about this, some of which aren't even on this list that I've already asked previously. Like, and some I have asked previously, why is Jigsaw doing this? Why is he choosing these people? Was Lawrence even worse to him as a doctor than we saw with his indifference? Was Zepp a sadist in the hospital? How does he know Amanda? What did Adam do to be left with such a horrible fate? How is photographing moral impropriety as bad as being photographed for your moral impropriety? What is Jigsaw's moral compass? Why kill the doctor after he's sort of figured out that he's being a shitheel? When he goes to the hotel and he's like, this is a terrible thing we're doing here. I gotta go. I'm out of here. Why torture a little girl? Why torture a wife who's already dealing with an unfaithful husband? Where's the compass for gratitude? Is it just because they have money and they don't have cancer? What kind of cancer is this? Was he always a sadist, or is it because he's dying now he's going to play out sadistic, intrusive thoughts? Maybe it's a brain tumor. Was he bedridden? Was he faking it? How is he orchestrating from bed? When did he start getting like this? Did Lawrence survive? Or did Jigsaw find him in the hallway and kill him? Where is this building? Is the building significant, or did he just choose it because it was gross? Does anybody come back for Adam, or does he die in the dark? Is anybody looking for Adam? Like, does anybody miss him in his life? Does anybody looking for Tap? Like, is Dina Meyer keeping up on Tap and now is looking for where he is? How did Tap yell so loud with a slit throat? I don't get it. Are those people at the end of the movie with Diana and Allison neighbors? Like, where did they, where are they? Did Allison ever call the police, or did she just keep trying to call the cell phone? And speaking of the cell phone, are we supposed to think that 9/11 plays a part in this movie? Because when we first see the cell phone, the date on the phone is September 10th, 2001. This happens the day before 9/11. And because this movie is made in 2003, this is a conscious choice these filmmakers made. Is it like the memes all say that the Saw characters are in for an even worse day tomorrow? Like, what is it, a nod? Is there something that I missed about? Why even show us this? And so that last one is mainly just me wanting to call attention to the fact that the date on the phone is the day before 9/11. Like, why pick that date and do nothing about it? Is there anything about 9/11 in any of the sequels?
Not at all.
Yeah, so I don't understand that choice. And like I said, if any of these questions are in fact answered in the sequels, I know a lot of these questions are answered in the sequels because I did sort of read the Wikipedia synopsis on most of them. And unfortunately, I don't really have a desire to move forward with the franchise, even though I really do like Shawnee Smith. I like the fact that the Amanda character comes back, and that was another thing too about the Zepp character. I like that it was a crazy guy, not a crazy woman. Like I said, I will give this movie credit for this being mostly men and not resting on the titillation of women in peril. I loved that. This is all very unsatisfying for somebody watching this movie in 2004 when this is the only movie. My dissatisfaction from the lack of explanation now, even though there are 9 sequels ahead of me is exactly what somebody watching this for the first time when it was still a standalone movie would have been feeling. And so even though somebody can say, "Oh, you find that out in the third one or you find that out in the fifth one or whatever," it's like that's not helpful to the audience that first saw this movie. And so I have to judge this movie based on what it is alone, because when it did come out, there was no guarantee that there was going to be one sequel, let alone nine sequels to this movie. So you can't rest on that, like, oh, you'll find out eventually. And that's a problem. That's a problem for me. So, like I said, this ending is, like I said, there's part of it, the reveal is extremely well orchestrated, very creative, but the lack of explanation for so many things overshadows it a little bit. And it kind of prevents me from wanting to revisit this movie because what will happen is every time I watch this, I'll be like, okay, Tap, how long are you going to sit there watching Zepp in Lawrence's apartment and doing nothing? You know, all of this kind of thing. And like, I'll be every time something bad happens to Zepp, I'll be like, Jigsaw, what the hell did Zepp do to you? You know, all of these questions are just going to be reinforced in my mind over that. So it took this potentially fantastic ending and watered it down a little bit with the fact that we are still left, you know, we opened too many doors. If we left those doors closed, I wouldn't be wondering what's in those doors. I wouldn't even know those doors existed. But because I know those doors exist, I'm thinking about them. And that's an issue for me. So it's like on one hand, this ending is incredible. On the other hand, this ending is just sort of like, wait, what? We're just going to leave Adam there? The hell did Adam do? You know, how did this cancer, who made this cancer guy judge, jury, and executioner of everybody who just doesn't do what he thinks they should do with life? And like you were saying, again, if we had not had as much of the moral compass Cliff's notes for Jigsaw given to us, the fact that he is just indiscriminate and is willing to torture people who probably helped him at one point and just little kids. He'll torture a little kid just to get to their dad. I mean, that's pretty bad of a person. But we open the Pandora's box, and when you open it, you can't close it, and you gotta see it through sometimes. So it's very unfortunate, I think, because like I said, this ending is brilliant. It was nothing we'd ever seen before. You know, yes, if somebody, you know, if somebody died and comes back to life, we knew that character. We didn't know this guy. He was dead before we even got there. Nobody had done that before. This was very original and very surprising. But I think I would have had the same questions had I not known that this was coming. But and I would have been, and I still would have been shocked. But I think maybe on the drive home, I would have been like, wait a minute, what the hell did Adam do to be left alone to bleed out in the dark like that? Because I thought about this. I thought as I'm watching this ending, I'm like, yeah, that's Jigsaw, but what about all this other shit? I think it would have taken me maybe an hour longer to get there if I had seen this without knowing that Jigsaw was on the floor, but I still think I would have gotten there. So I think it's unfortunate that we opened too many doors, that our imaginations and our desire for resolution has been activated so much that it, like I said, it waters down the otherwise brilliant twist ending.
I guess, you know, as our mutual friend Charles Skaggs likes to reference the quote from Edward Nygma in Batman Forever: "Too many questions, Mr. Wayne." So I think that is very apt. But you make some great points as always, Zan. And but I agree with you though. The ending of Saw is the moment that elevates it from a solid low budget thriller to something people still talk about years later. What I love about it is how simple it is, because there's no giant explosion. There's no long speech explaining every detail. It's just a shift in perspective, a realization. I mean, the film doesn't add anything new in that final stretch. It reveals what was already there. And that's what makes it feel earned, as you were mentioning. You know, when the truth clicks into place, it's not just shocking, it's almost humiliating in a way, because you realize you were looking in the wrong direction.
The whole time! It
exactly.
was right there the whole time, and you're like, you're doing the V8 smack on your face, but like I said, the movie never gives you that. It never gives you the hint.
which is very, very clever. Yeah, because you realize you were looking in the wrong direction the whole time. And the movie played fair too. There were maybe some clues, but maybe we just didn't assemble them correctly. I certainly didn't. And that kind of twist respects the audience. Emotionally, it's brutal. I mean, the final moments don't offer comfort or rescue. There's no heroic turnaround. The door closes, and that's it. The sound design and the music do a lot of heavy lifting there. Of course, the theme would become very famous and is still now very recognizable when it comes to the Klauser score. And the rising intensity, I think, paired with that cold final image creates a punch that lingers. What I think really works is that the ending reinforces the film's core theme about control. From the beginning, everything felt chaotic and desperate, but the last reveal shows that none of it was random. Every movement, every choice, every panic attack happened within someone else's design. And that realization makes the whole experience feel tighter, dare I say suffocating in hindsight. As I mentioned at the top of this review, it's mean, but it's effective. And it doesn't just end the story, no pun intended, it locks it shut with no hope left. So as grim as that might sound, I was very pleased with this ending. So let's get if we were the Academy segment. This film was not nominated for anything, but could have been eligible for the 77th Academy Awards, where the film with the most nominations and awards was The Aviator. Best Picture that year went to $1 Million Baby. So Zan, do you think that Saw should have been nominated by the Academy?
No, I don't. And 2004 was not my favorite year Oscar-wise. $1 Million Baby is a great performance by Hilary Swank, but do I want to watch it over and over again? Not really. We were talking about this before. The Aviator, Kate Blanchett's always good. Leo's always good. Do I want to watch him go crazy? No. I mean, and The Aviator is another one where I want to say I'd rather watch a documentary. But that's just me. So yeah, it's not my favorite year Oscar-wise or really movie-wise. It's kind of a dry year, but there's some real standouts. This is a year that has things like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. This is The Incredibles. This is Hotel Rwanda. If we're going to go weird, this is Napoleon Dynamite was this year. And you have movies like Sky Captain and The World of Tomorrow, which are very bizarre, very different, very reliant on special effects in an era when that might not have been the greatest thing in the world. But it's very different and it's very interesting. This is not, like I said, this is not one that I would particularly go back to necessarily. And as creative as this movie was, it's not enough to get Oscars attention for a horror movie, especially a slasher movie, especially a torture horror movie. The only thing I will say about it is the set design, the art design in this was exceptional. That disgusting bathroom added so much to the unease of this movie and, felt small for as big as it was and felt big for as small as it was, felt confining, yet it felt confining, yet had our characters seemingly miles away from each other. It was really well done the way they did the set of this movie. And I think that's also where I would almost like to see this movie be smaller. Just see it be these two guys in this room, our faceless villain, and, go from there. Like I said, less questions. But that being said, this is one room that's gross. It's covered in, blood and piss and shit. It's disgusting. Is it going to go up against things like Phantom of the Opera, Lemony Snicket, or Finding Neverland? No, it's not. So this is not an Oscar win for me.
Which is very fair, of course. I think the most realistic possibility would have been maybe Best Original Screenplay. I mean, the structure is tight, the concept is strong, and the twist, as we've talked about, is genuinely clever. So for a low-budget thriller, that kind of narrative design is impressive. It takes one location, a handful of performers, and builds a sustained mystery with a payoff that then recontextualizes everything. And that is writing craft. Maybe you could also argue for film editing, as in that frantic stylized cutting during certain sequences does give the movie its identity. Whether someone likes that style or not, I mean, it's deliberate and it's distinctive. And I think it helped define the film's tone and later influenced a wave of horror that followed. Once again, you can love it, you can hate it, but it was very, very distinctive. But here's the reality, as we know. Horror films, especially graphic ones, rarely get serious Academy recognition. And at the time, as you were mentioning, Zan, the Oscars leaned heavily toward prestige dramas, historical epics, biopics, and emotionally respectable material. I mean, Saw was gritty and violent and marketed as a shocking genre film. And that does work against you in awards season. Also, I'd say perception, because when Saw came out, it was quickly labeled as part of a rising torture horror trend. That label, I find, oversimplified it and pushed it into exploitation territory in the eyes of many critics and voters. And once a film gets boxed into that category, it's hard for voters to look past the gore and see the structure underneath. I have said such wonderful things of films like Toxic Avenger, for example. I think that film is seriously underrated. That said, when it comes to this, budget and campaign matter as well, because awards recognition isn't just about quality. It's about positioning, studio backing, and strategic campaigning. And this small, scrappy horror film doesn't usually have the same awards push as a major studio drama. So could it have deserved a nomination? Once again, I think you can make a case for screenplay, maybe editing. But was it ever realistically going to be nominated at the Academy Awards? Not in that climate, and not ever probably. It was influential, it was profitable, and culturally impactful. And the Oscars don't always reward those things, as we know. So, getting to ratings. This one's going to be interesting, I think. Zan, what do you give Saw out of 10?
I had to really think about this one because I am definitely a proponent of just because I don't like it doesn't mean it's bad. But I do feel like the things I didn't like about this movie are legitimate issues with this movie. Like I said, I don't particularly see myself revisiting this one, and I'm not terribly interested in going forward with it, which is a shame because, like I said, I like Shawnee Smith. I am interested in where this Amanda character even came from. I like that they took her and did something with her. But at the same time, I have read some synopses, and I don't want to see this poor girl get caught in his game again. You know, that's depressing. And even though I assume that most of my answers will be retroactively answered by the sequels, I'd still have to, watch gross torture and gross spaces of people that may or may not fall into a moral compass that I understand, And I also thought about this, like, am I looking at this from, too critical of an eye for the fact that it is not answering enough for me? Because I have liked other horror movie franchises that give us more backstory as the franchise goes on. Nightmare on Elm Street is a great example. In the first movie, we have the moment where Nancy's mother tells her who Freddy Krueger is and why all the parents got together and killed him. And for some reason, I'm okay with the fact that we don't get a reason for why he was a child killer until the third movie. And maybe it was me growing up in the era of Adam Walsh that made me just accept that some people are awful and want to do terrible things to children. But finding out that he's a child killer and now he's killing the children of the people that killed him seemed personal enough of a motive to me and seemed to work for me. That's fine. I didn't find myself focusing on, well, why was he a child killer to begin with, the way I was focusing on Jigsaw. Why is he doing this in the first place? And I think it's because we get so much, no one appreciates this, and we get these glimpses into it that make me wonder, like, well, where'd you come up with this? It's like, same thing with Michael Myers. A 6-year-old kid that is just a bad seed is terrifying as a concept to me. I don't need the neglected middle child of a divorced mom with an abusive stepdad that kills animals and is bullied backstory that we got from Rob Zombie. I didn't need that at the time. And even though we got more information in the third movie, and we find out one of my favorite lines in horror movies, that Freddy is the bastard son of 100 maniacs, I didn't need it. It was interesting to learn, but it didn't feel like it was like, oh, okay, now I feel better about the first movie. It wasn't one of those kinds of things, because Jigsaw alludes to judgment of the character, to judging the character of his victims yet no one seems that egregious. You wind up thinking, really? This guy, dead alone, bleeding in the dark, surrounded by shit because he's a sleazy photographer? That seems excessive. You, you know, I don't I don't feel like putting in the work to wanting to trying to learn more. Just I don't want to wait to learn more on the off chance another sequel is going to be greenlit. You know what I mean? Like on the off chance that there's another movie to answer more questions, isn't enough for me to feel like the questions aren't unsatisfying. Like, oh, maybe I'll find out someday. No, I feel like it's unsatisfying. So I really thought about that because, like, are there other movies that have done this in a way that didn't leave me wanting? And yes, there are. That did it a better way. That being said, too, these are extremely creative kills. Jigsaw's a very creative concept. I totally get why people like this movie. It's just not for me. I like atmosphere and backstory and folklore and unfolding and a crescendo to a resolution. That's the kind of thing I like in a horror movie. We've talked about this before. One of my favorite horror movies is The Changeling. I'm thinking that might actually be my favorite horror movie. I don't know. I can't decide. This week it is. Because it like starts out weird and creepy, and then we learn little by little by little by little, and then we figure out this horrible thing that happened in the past that is now coming back for vengeance, and then the house burns down. It's, like I said, it's atmosphere. Everything I just said that I like in a horror movie, The Changeling does. Atmosphere, backstory, folklore, crescendo, unfolding, climax, resolution. All of that kind of happens. I'm not in horror movies for the kills. I'm appreciative when they are comedic. I'm appreciative when they're creative. I'm appreciative when they are not fetishistic or titillating. Like I said, there are so many horror movies where knives linger too long on the breasts of women, and it just feels fetishistic and titillating are the best words I can think of. That these are movies made by people who have some seriously unresolved issues when it comes to wanting to see harm come to women. I appreciate when a movie doesn't do that, and this movie does not do that. For as tortury as the reputation was, Nick, you said something good about that. This got a reputation for being one of the torture movies. You're seeing people be tortured. Like I said, you see them being tortured, but you're not watching it happen. Even when Cary Elwes is sawing his foot off, you see a little bit of cut, and then you're watching Adam scream, and then you're watching Cary Elwes' face get sprayed with blood. You don't see him cut his foot off. You don't see a foot until the poster of the movie. So I appreciate that about this movie. There's a lot of things about this I appreciate, and I appreciate why people like it. But for me, it's not my kind of movie because of how much it alluded to, but then left out, how much it alluded to, but didn't resolve. I'm well aware this movie is not for me, but I give it a 6 out of 10. Recognizing what it has become, recognizing its creativity, recognizing its originality. But again, when it comes to horror, you've got to have more than a good concept. You have to have a good execution. And like I said, this one nailed the reveal, but didn't nail the ending for me. Because even at the end of the day, I'm still left thinking, what the fuck did Adam do? Like you were saying, it's terrifying. You have the crescendo of the music. You have Adam reaching out, screaming. First of all, you have Adam thinking he's maybe going to shoot Jigsaw, and then Jigsaw electrocutes him. And then he just gets up, he pulls the thing off of himself, and he just tells Adam, he turns off the light, and he tells Adam, game over. And that is tense and terrifying and unsettling. But still, what the fuck did Adam do to deserve this? Because the movie alludes to a moral compass, but it doesn't follow through on that. I've talked about this before. When a movie sets up its own rules and then breaks them, it's unsatisfying for me. It's part of why I like Freddy instead of Jason. Freddy is dead this whole time. He gets you in your dreams. Anything goes in dreams. Yeah, okay, there's a whole thing about pulling him out of the dream, whatever. But is that a dream? Is it real? I don't know. Because then we go in right to another dream. So, we don't know. Whereas Jason has to come back to life because kids dig him up and put a stake through his heart that then gets hit by lightning. Like, you have to keep rewriting the rules for it. And so, because this one alludes to rules, but doesn't really outline them, I find myself questioning the rules. And this movie even says, these are the rules. This is why these people are dying. There are rules here, but I never learn what they are. So there's just something unsatisfying about it. And I almost feel like because it nails the reveal so well, I'm even more unsatisfied because I know these filmmakers can do some amazing things. And if the amount of attention had been paid to every aspect of this movie that was paid to the reveal of Jigsaw, I think it would have been something really spectacular. And and I hate saying that because I say something like, "Wow, kid, you showed so much promise and then you started drinking." I mean, I really sound like a parent that is holding your past sins against you or that is comparing you to your more successful older brother. But like I said, these filmmakers know what they're doing when it comes to being able to do something really spectacular and really creative and something we haven't seen before. In 2004, when we'd had, you know, a good like 40 years of slasher movies almost. You know, if you're thinking about like going back to like Psycho. We've had a lot of horror movies, and in the 1980s there were a lot of like direct to video horror movies because that was one of the most popular genres in the video rental business, and video stores were desperate for content to have enough movies for people to check out over the weekend. So there's a ton of horror movies out there by now for sure, but even by 2004 there were a ton of horror movies, and to do something this original and spectacular, just pay that whole attention to every can of worms you opened, every door you opened, give that attention to. And I think this could have been something, you know, I hate to judge this on what it could have been, but we know how good it could have been. But then you had all this other stuff that you just didn't do anything with. So yeah, it gets a 6 for me.
I would say though, like a good magistrate, you are firm, just, and fair, and and you back up your reasoning always very eloquently. I'm gonna give this a 7.5 out of 10, and here is why. I mean, on the craft level, it's impressive. The premise is clean and strong. The structure is tight. The twist genuinely lands. And for a low-budget film, it squeezes a lot out of very little. One main location, a small cast, and a ticking clock. That restraint actually works in its favor, and it feels raw and urgent. The atmosphere is another strength. As you were mentioning, it's grimy and claustrophobic and tense in a way that sticks with you. And the ending alone earns points because it recontextualizes the entire experience. And that final stretch is bold and memorable. Where it loses some points for me is in execution at times. As I alluded to earlier, the early 2000s editing style can feel abrasive now. Some performances are uneven. A few moments lean a little too hard into shock value instead of letting the psychological tension breathe. And you can feel that it's a first major feature in places. But influence matters too, as you were mentioning. It kicked off a massive franchise and shaped horror for years after. Now, whether someone loves it or hates it, it did leave a mark, and that counts. So I think a 7.5 feels fair, at least to me. It's not flawless, it's rough around the edges, but it's smart and it's tense and it's unforgettable in the ways that matter most. Once again, too much as far as I'm concerned. So getting to a gold standard feedback this week, we do have quite a bit, starting with Mr. Dave Proctor, who writes in about today's movie. So Zan, what does Dave have for us when it comes to Saw?
Dave says, "Hello, cinephiles. I want to shit on this movie, but I cannot. It is a classic. When I saw it in the theater as a youngin', I was hooked. Personally, it hooked me for the franchise. I don't think they are all as good, and honestly, I haven't seen them all yet. As life happened, I watched the first 3 or 4 and then let it go because it seemed formulaic and I caught on. But a couple of years ago, there was a bundle deal and now I own them all. I have not sat down to binge them yet, but it is on my to-do list for sure." This movie was unique insofar as horror goes from my perspective. It was a criminal escapade similar to Seven, dealing with body horror, and the traps are ingeniously diabolical. Anyone who can sit down and design such things should be on a list. They should be surveilled at least. This is where the ICE budget should be spent.
Agreed.
Danny Glover lends an aspect of legitimacy that a lot of horror does not have. Typically, stars get their start in horror, then become famous. Looking at you, Johnny Depp. I will say that there have been a lot of, I love the fact that Melvin Douglas ended his career in horror movies like Ghost Story and The Changeling. So the 70s had a lot of like classic Hollywood ending their careers in horror. I love it. That's my personal, that part was my personal thing. Dave didn't say that. Dave goes on to say, Glover is a pro, and he has made some mid to low quality work for sure. Who hasn't? But he is an A-lister in my book. Knowingly, I say this and acknowledge that my A-list is dated. So if Glover was too old for this shit in 1987, thank you, Dave, what was he in 2004? And why didn't we just work this into the Lethal Weapon franchise? Mel Gibson getting his head open all the way by a reverse bear trap? I mean, who wouldn't like to see that? And dislocating his shoulder would make him not let him escape. I would like to interject in here, Dave, that 2 years later was our sugar tits rant. So I'm sure he had already started pissing off people in Hollywood before he got pulled over by the cops. Carrie Elways. I know who he is, of course, but The Princess Bride is more my wife and daughter's go-to. Ken Leung is a very familiar face. You hate to see it ruined like that. I see what you did there. That brings us to Michael Emerson. I think I see his face when I close my eyes in every nightmare. He wasn't the actual bad guy, but he sells the ruse 100%. And I agree. I think he definitely has that. He works his face in this to make you seriously question, like, are you part of this or what's the deal here? There is something cathartic in this type of movie. It cleanses negative emotions for sure. Like therapy, only not as thorough. Like an over-the-counter therapy medicine, perhaps. Tobin Bell isn't quite that guy as the others, but I recognize his talent for sure. Yeah, I think he definitely has the chops to be that guy. I have a special little sensitivity to the horror of sending a bullet that I can't pull back. I had actual nightmares for the last 30 years of that specifically. It makes me doubly avoid that in real life. Complacency is the enemy of alertness and sound judgment. Very true. Horror is a place in my collection that I neglected for too long. My wife hates it, so I avoided it out of deference. But now that you can watch whatever, whenever, literally, I have gone back to watching horror. I have a huge backlog. I gave this movie 10 out of 10 peanuts I found while sticking my arm deep in the toilet looking for a key. Again, why did he go right for the bowl? The heart is on the tank. Just go to the tank. Thanks for putting this in the on-deck position and keep up the good work. Dave Proctor. Thank you, Dave. And again, thank you for putting up with my additions to your feedback, because every time you give feedback, you always give me something to think about, and I always want to respond.
He always gives us food for thought, does Mr. Proctor. We very much appreciate his feedback. Speaking of great people giving feedback, we have some from Aaron Case this week, voicing his opinion on Saw. And of course, his subject this one is, do you want to play a game? And he starts off with,
Hello, DJ Nick, Zan, and Rachel, or as they call you around the podcasting community, Gold Standard Hosts. Would you like to read an email? For years you have reviewed movies and shared your opinions, but now I must ask of you, are you willing to sacrifice your credibility by reading a silly, absurd, and goofy email? Live or die, make your choice.
Couldn't
Aaron,
resist
we reviewed Showgirls, okay? Throw it at us.
Exactly. We could take it, and it's gonna get even.
We reviewed
even more.
it and loved it. Give us what you got, my friends.
Yes, indeed. And Aaron continues, okay, I couldn't resist having a bit of fun with my intro because I fucking love this franchise, from the great heights to the god-awful lows. And for this podcast to go from American Graffiti to Saw is such a jarring whiplash that I could not be more excited to be here for. Thank you, Aaron. Saw is a franchise that changed me in many ways most people associate with the emerging slasher franchises of the 70s and 80s. I always found it funny how people can remember small details from Friday the 13th, Part 7, or identify a single frame from Halloween Resurrection. And then Saw came along, and my love of the franchise gave me a series of movies in which I could finally relate to those fans. I know these movies backwards and forwards, except Spiral, because it's a dumpster fire and a waste of all talent involved. Agreed. But you're not covering the franchise as a whole, you're reviewing the first, so I will try and do the same. I love the simplicity of the story and the way it unravels. First and foremost, it's just a movie about two guys sitting in a room wondering how they got there. But through flashbacks, their stories get a deeper tale, and it's also in those flashbacks that we get sprinkles of Jigsaw's identity. I'll be honest, If the movie ended with Michael Emerson's Zepp being the man behind everything, I still believe this would hold up as a great thriller. True. But that one last rug pull where Adam finds the tape recorder and the now iconic theme, along with Hello Zepp, kicking in, is jaw-dropping. While I tried to wrap my head around what's going on, Kramer slowly stands up in the background and my mind was blown. I don't know if this is the greatest twist in horror movie history, but it's certainly my favorite. What fascinates me most is that this movie was just a low-budget thriller that no one really knew how to distribute, yet became a bit of a sensation. Certainly did. I once read an interview with Lee Whannell where he talked about how he and James Wan envisioned this as a thriller comparable to David Fincher's Seven. Yet the studio was unsure how to approach the marketing. I can see that. The producers suggested relegating it into the horror genre as a way to reach out to broader audiences. I find this to be a bit of a shame because I have to wonder if the series would have evolved differently had it felt less inclined to fit into the horror genre. I do have a couple of questions to ask of all of you. First, a few years ago, DJ Nick and I had a chance to talk after I joined him and Keith on an episode of Happiness and Darkness, and he and I had a conversation about the then recently released Saw 10, which he and I both enjoyed. So what are your thoughts, if any, on the sprawling amount of sequels? Zan, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's funny. I have not seen any of the sequels. I'll say that. Like I said, I am mildly interested in the Amanda character, and I do like Shawnee Smith, so I'm tempted, but I'm more tempted to read a Wikipedia entry before I watch a movie. Tuesday, 2 days ago, we're recording this on a Thursday. Chris and I went to see Michael Shannon and Jason Narducci play REM's Life's Rich Pageant album, and then some more stuff after that. Opening for them was Bobcat Goldthwait. And Bobcat Goldthwait has been telling a joke about the Police Academy movies for 40 years that is still funny to this day. And he said someone asked him one time about how he would feel if somebody rebooted Police Academy. And he said, well, if they're going to do it, they should go the way they did with 21 Drum Street and make it a comedy this time. You know, just sort of making fun of the fact that Police Academy movies are very sort of based on, you know, not very well received critically comedy movies. And then, you know, we all start laughing, and then he starts, he's like, no, they really needed to make 8. So many unanswered questions. I feel like that's literally true of this. I feel like there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm getting the impression that each sequel answers something and then asks another question. Like, I feel like they close a door while literally opening another one. I get the feeling that they are just creating more mysteries for us to wonder about as an audience. So, it sort of feels to me like this franchise is kind of human centipeding itself when it comes to plot lines and questions. Do I think this is great for people who like this franchise? Absolutely. From a storytelling standpoint, I think if you need 10 movies to tell it that you didn't initially plot out, you are just building on yourself. And that can be good and that can be bad. And in this one, like I said, I feel like there's so much dissatisfaction with the unanswered questions that I think it's asking a lot of an audience to want to come back on the off chance you'll answer their questions. You know, because these are not like David Lynch nonlinear movies where you go in it thinking like, okay, things happen and I need to accept that. This is trying to follow a fairly linear storyline, even though it's told out of order. But overall, it's a linear storyline. I think it asks a lot for somebody to come back 9 times when it starts out being so unsatisfying. I'll just say that.
That's totally fair. I mean, I guess to answer it from the point of view of somebody who has seen all 10 installments, even the terrible Spiral movie, which I could not stand, and I agree with Aaron, it was a waste of so many great actors. I mean, yeah, because as we were talking about, the Saw series is interesting because it turned this small, clever horror film into a huge franchise. And the original worked because it was simple. The tight story, the strong twist, and the moral game between victims and the killer Yeah, as the sequels like Saw 2 through Saw 3D came out, the series did become more like an ongoing soap opera about the legacy of Jigsaw. And some fans love tracking the complicated timeline and the apprentices, while others feel the mythology eventually became a bit bloated. And later entries like Jigsaw and Spiral tried to reboot things, while Saw 10 worked better by going back in the timeline and focusing on John Kramer as a character. So in the end, the many sequels are both the franchise's strength, I would say, and the weakness, because they built this unique horror mythology, but the yearly releases sometimes stretched the idea thin. Still, I would say the fact that people are debating the series decades later shows how strong the core concept is. And we should be getting some more, I think, down the pike. So I hope that answers your question, Aaron. And Aaron has a second one for us. And he says, along with other movies like Hostel, we were cursed with the term torture porn, and it quickly became its own subgenre within horror. I personally have never liked this phrase because there are far more gruesome movies out there that don't get slapped with that label. Additionally, the idea of declaring that some people get off on this kind of stuff is almost as silly as declaring that The Sound of Music is musical porn. As I step off my small soapbox, I want to ask, what are your thoughts on the creation and use of the phrase torture porn? Zan, would you like to field that one first?
Sure. Like I said, I think a lot of these torture movies linger so much that they do feel fetishistic and titillating, or an attempt at titillating. Um, I would not call Saw torture porn. I will say that I had a misconception about it being a torture porn. It's not. At least this first one isn't. Um, when I think of torture porn, I think of things like Martyrs and Serbian film, and people are definitely getting off on that. If you've never seen Martyrs, keep it that way. I feel like I can't scrub my soul hard enough to get that movie out of me. And it is extremely fetishistic. It very much sexualizes the pain of women. And it's movies like that that make me think that term is an apt term. I don't think it is a misnomer for some things. I think things get maybe mislabeled as torture porn because there is torture horror and there is torture porn. I don't think this is necessarily torture. This is torture horror for sure because the horror comes from torture. Um, but there is torture porn out there. There are, and I have unfortunately been in rooms, theaters, that is, with people who enjoyed themselves a little too much the way you don't want them to when watching things like Martyrs. Specifically, I'm thinking of my experience watching Martyrs, that there were people that were getting way too excited about the fact that, I don't care if they're being tortured, they're naked, that kind of thing. There's a sexualization to a lot of torture porn that makes that term apt, I think. And that's one thing I wanted to say from the get-go when I was talking about this movie, that this movie does a really good job of not being that. First of all, like I said, we see guys. These are men. That's not usually how this works. Even with women filmmakers, you don't necessarily see them lingering on, genitals when making torture stories about men, that kind of thing. And even the women we see, like I was talking with the Amanda character, the torture is done on her head, like on her face. The reverse bear trap thing. It has nothing to do with her breasts or her genitals or anything about her that is female. And she's being tortured because, let's be honest, probably nobody's going to miss her as, as a recovering addict, as somebody who has probably burned a lot of bridges in her life. That's where the moral compass is coming from. And she's not being tortured because of sexuality or anything like that. And again, we only spend about 5 minutes with her, and but they are two very different things, torture horror and torture porn. And the line is very definite. And when you jump over it, you leap over it. Actually, I take that back. The line can be blurred sometimes. And I think that's where Eli Roth comes in. I think Eli Roth grew up in the 80s, just like I did, watching horror movies that were watching slasher movies that were blood and boobs. and he liked that. And this is his version of having more of that in his movies. He likes gore and he likes boobs. And I feel like he combines those in a way that gives him gore and boobs. I think sometimes he straddles the line between being too interested in the gore being on the boobs, but I would not, like I said, I don't think he's in Martyrs or even Serbian film type of torture porn area. Those I think are our barometers right there. Like, where does it rank on it? Like, for me, as a woman, Martyrs is my barometer for like, is this, where are we on the Martyrs level when it comes to, the pain and exploitation of women? Whereas a Serbian film is the barometer of where are we on the pain and exploitation of literally everyone living, dead, adult, infant, child. So, I will give Serbian film credit for leaving no stone unturned, but you do have movies like Martyrs that really do feel like they're there for the titillation of it. And it makes me very uncomfortable. It makes me very uncomfortable navigating a world where I know this exists and that there are filmmakers that want to show this and people who want to see it. It makes me very uncomfortable in this genre that I otherwise feel so welcomed by and that I call home and that I have been calling home since I was about 10 years old. The horror genre, it's like an offshoot that it's almost its own horror movie where there's that lingering threat behind you, that there are people that are interested in the pain being inflicted on femininity, I think. So I think it's an apt term, but I do think it is thrown around more than it needs to be. Because like I said, you guys can tell me more about 2 through 9, but Saw is not torture porn. It's definitely torture, but it's not torture porn.
And I think it's very good to make that distinction for sure. I mean, I guess, critics were trying to describe a wave of horror that focused on prolonged suffering and elaborate traps and graphic violence.
Yeah,
and
I think they were. I think they were trying to. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nick, but I think the critics were trying to come up with a term that porn. We all know that we're there for the sex when we're watching porn. We're not there for the plot line. We're not there for the dialogue. We're not there for the special effects. We're there for the sex. And even I say I jokingly say that I watch Godzilla movies the way I watch porn. It's like, I don't care what's going on with the scientists. Like, give me Godzilla, and that's what I want to see. So I think that's where the term also can be used because of, we're here for the gore, the way we are for porn. But I do think that there is a subgenre of the genre that is in fact there for the titillation of the gore as well. So I think that there's an intention to describe something the way you would describe porn, but then I think there is an aspect of it where some people do find it titillating in the way they would find porn titillating in a way that makes me extremely uncomfortable. So I'm sorry, please continue.
Oh, no worries at all. I mean, it almost makes me think, I guess, of the distinction that people make between eroticism and pornography, and that's another line which one could look at, and do a whole episode about. But yes, I do think that the phrase may be stuck because it was provocative and easy to repeat, not necessarily because it was always accurate. And I think one problem with the label is that it does flatten very different films, as you were mentioning, into the same category. Because, Saw is built around puzzles, morality plays, and twisty storytelling, while Hostel, for example, leans more into exploitation and shock. Lumping them together under one loaded phrase, I think, makes it sound like the only point of these movies is to watch people suffer, which ignores the other things they're doing, where that's social commentary, mystery, or just old school horror mechanics. And there's also a bit of selective outrage baked into the term. I mean, graphic violence, as you were mentioning, Zan, has existed in horror for decades. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Cannibal Holocaust or The Evil Dead pushed boundaries long before the 2000s. Yet those movies are usually discussed in terms of shock, grindhouse, or extreme horror, rather than being framed as something audiences are supposedly getting off on. And the porn part, I think, of the label carries a moral judgment that tends to shut down conversation rather than clarify what the films are actually doing. And I think, Erin's comparison to calling The Sound of Music musical porn gets at the same issue, because it's a deliberately exaggerated label that implies that the audience's only motivation is indulgence. In reality, as you were saying, you call the horror movie genre home. Exactly. People watch horror for all kinds of reasons: tension, or catharsis, or curiosity, or the craft of special effects, or the puzzle box storytelling that movies like Saw thrive on. So ultimately, I would say the phrase torture porn probably tells you more about the moment when critics felt overwhelmed by a trend than it does about the movies themselves. It's catchy, but it's also reductive. I think most of the time it's a shortcut for this kind of horror I don't understand, for example, which is fair as an opinion, but I don't think very helpful as a category. And so I do agree. You make a great point, Zan, about the fact of, like you said, torture horror and torture porn, and we could do a whole episode about this. But at least that's the way I see it. And Erin ends his email. It's only fitting that I conclude with game over. Take care, Erin. Well, Erin, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful email.
Well played.
Exactly. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Zan, when it came to this, what we were talking about?
Like you said, we can do an entire episode on this, but I think you really hit on something about it being a term that is intended to elicit shame, because we've talked about this forever. This entire podcast, we've talked about what movies are and are not deemed Oscar worthy by the Academy, and horror is definitely one of them. There is this mentality that horror movies are less cerebral, and people who watch them don't really care about storytelling and writing, and that horror is seen as one of the baser genres, and it's not true. There's some shitty horror movies out there, but there are some shitty romantic comedies and some shitty drama movies and some really bad costume period pieces and terrible musicals and terrible action movies. And I think that there can also be how do I want to put this? Especially in like a historical drama, I think you can go in a way that, sensationalizes the horrible things humans do to each other. There are movies that, linger too much on human depravity. And it's not that kind of thing is not isolated to any sort of genre. But I think you're right. I think the term is there to sort of elicit shame, and not just sexually, but like from a horror standpoint. And I think that, like, we talked about this when we talked about Silence of the Lambs, that people trip over themselves to say that is a thriller, not a horror movie. That man eats somebody's tongue out and steals his face. That is a horror movie. I'm sorry. Read Thomas Harris's books. They're horror novels. I'm sorry.
110%. And here, of course, at Gold Standard, we value every single pretty much genre of movies, and we definitely don't use the term porn to shame anything. Actually, we might actually be reviewing an adult movie down the line. So
I'm never gonna shame a genre where women can make 10 times as much money as the men can. I'll shame predatory filmmakers. I will shame predatory producers that are in jail now. Thank you very much, and who have, I would sooner shame fucking Harvey Weinstein, who produced a lot of the Oscar-winning movies that we've talked about, than I would shame somebody for watching or making an erotic thriller, shall we say. That's not what we're about here, because one thing that we will all say on this podcast is, any movie you make is still better than any movie we've ever made, because we haven't made one. So there's something to be said about, the creativity and ingenuity and collaboration that goes into making movies. What we wind up criticizing is motivation. And, if there is something unsavory in a movie, we're going to look at the motivation and we'd criticize that more than we'd criticize like an entire genre or anything. Because, like I said, we watched Showgirls and we all loved it. Rachel didn't, but you and I did and Maureen did. There's value in a lot of things that the mainstream world might want to shame you for. So we're not about any of that here. But will we talk about, like, did you land did you land the ending? Maybe, maybe not. Are you good at dialogue? I'll be the first person to tell you. David Lynch is my favorite director. Is he great at dialogue? Not really. We love Star Wars. Is George Lucas great at dialogue? Not necessarily. But are there other parts that are fantastic? Absolutely. So, it's all about being objective about what you're looking at, what you're doing, and what your motivation is. Like, do you want to film women suffering? Okay. Why? Do you want to shed a light on the injustice that women have? Or do you want to look at women suffering because you like looking at that? Like, that's where we're going to start talking about it. And that's like going back to Martyrs. Is Martyrs a well done movie? Yeah, it's very well paced. It's very well crafted. I never want to see it again. I don't like the fact that I'm talking about it this much because I'm going to think about it for another 5 days. Like I said, if you've never seen it, keep it that way. You're better off because it sticks to your soul like napalm. It's a tough one. It's one of the toughest movies I've ever seen.
I am right there with you. I have seen it, and yes, it's going to haunt me now for a couple of days as well. But yes, as always, eloquent as always, and that's exactly what our mission statement here is. Of course, a gold standard, of course, reviewing all the movies and what have you. But yeah, and you never know, might have some surprises for you down the line when it comes to some movies we will review during the course of this year. But yeah, once again, big thank you to Aaron and Dave. And of course, dear listeners, if you want to share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, just like Dave and Aaron, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Feel free to follow us on our social media. You can find us on X at Oscars Gold, Facebook, where you can find us as Gold Standard, the Oscars podcast, and also Blue Sky, where we're also at Oscars Gold. We, of course, love hearing from you guys, and we also appreciate the follow and the support. And also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite films, you can join our wonderful family of patrons on Patreon and check out what we have going on there. You also get to unlock our previous reviews of such films previously selected by our patrons, such as recently Sense and Sensibility, The Illusionist, 1917, Hairspray, and many more. So to join our Golden Army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars. And a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, this month, our patrons have selected Captain Phillips for us to review, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. Looking forward to that. And lastly, of course, if you are listening to us on such platforms as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, you name it, be sure to rate and review us, as that keeps the algorithm stimulated and allows our little podcast to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your neighbors, tell your pets. We don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so. Future thank you to those who will. So, Zan, when you're not here discussing films that spawned franchises, where can folks find you on the interwebs?
You can find me with our friend Charles Skaggs on our podcast, Drunk Cinema, where we discuss our favorite movies over our favorite adult beverages and record that discussion for your entertainment. We're recording tomorrow, and I should probably figure out what that is. Unfortunately, we talk about it, then I get drunk, and then I have zero memory of what our discussion was. So I'm glad we record it. If you want to find me on social media, your best bets would be Instagram, TikTok, or Letterboxd. I have started becoming more active on my Letterboxd. I'm also on Blue Sky and Substack, but not as much. But yeah, Instagram, Letterboxd, and TikTok are your best bets. And my handle on all of those is Udinax19.
Fantastic stuff, and definitely be sure to follow Zan in all her multiple endeavors. And when it comes to our missing co-host, Rachel Friend, be sure to follow her on her podcast, The Five-ish Fangirls, where, of course, they discuss any and every topic from the female perspective, geeky and nerdy, because, as Rachel says, of course, fangirls are real fans too. And for more information about that, you can visit their website, which is the fiveishfangirls.com, where you also get access to their personal social media accounts as well. When it comes to myself, you can find me hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for you guys, from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. For more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. Podcast-wise, if you're fans of those superhero movies, as of course Aaron was alluding to, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness and Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where we do discuss any and every superhero movie under the sun and beyond. We recently reviewed The Matrix, which was a fun revisit after so many years, but a very philosophical discussion, as to be expected. Coming up next, we're going to go back into regular superhero fare, and as St. Patrick's Day is coming up, we decided to go with something green, and so we're going to be doing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. So looking forward to talking about that one. And last but certainly not least, speaking of that Charles Skaggs guy, him and I can be found on the Fandom Zone podcast, where we're currently reviewing the first and only season so far of Wonder Man, the latest, of course, chapter in the MCU. And speaking of things to come on this show, next time as our wait for the 98th Best Picture will be finally over, we will be reviewing The Winner. Will it be Sinners? Will it be one battle after another? Hamnet, or even Marty Supreme? We will all find out together. So, Zan, anything you would like to add on what might be our next film, or anything else before we sign off?
Well, as much as I would like to be toasting the Best Picture with a good cold Roadhouse beer, I think we're going to be drinking gin and champagne. So we'll see. For those of you who don't know, gin and champagne plus lemon and simple syrup is a French 75. So take that take that prediction for what you will.
I love that, and I guess we shall see. I have my thoughts as well, but I will save those for a little game that we are actually playing when it comes to the Oscars and the Academy Awards. Definitely excited to see what happens. So, of course, folks, thanks as always for listening to the show and supporting us. We will see you next time with the 98th Best Picture winner, whatever that might be, and of course on Patreon with Captain Phillips. Until then, enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thank you to Dave and Aaron for writing in. And an all-round thank you all so much for the privilege of your time. Ciao. Bobby.